Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Well, welcome everyone to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good. I'm your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jake Jacobs, who has consulted with hundreds of organizations from Fortune 50 to nonprofits and has supported them in many change initiatives and directives. Everything from strategy implementation to culture change to mergers and acquisitions and leadership development. He also has written several books, including his latest bestseller, Leverage Change: 8 Ways to Achieve Faster, Easier, and Better Results. Welcome, Jake. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Charles, for having me.
So I'd like to jump right in, and I love the analogy you use in the book with these 8 levers, and it comes from Aristotle, right? From his famous quote. And I'd love for you to kind of connect the dots for us to say, what made you use this analogy when talking about change management?
Sure. So this comes from Archimedes, who was a 3rd century BC Greek mathematician. And as the story goes, in the olden days when Archimedes was alive, they would have competitions across the countryside for who was the strongest man. And they would test their strength by pushing boulders. And Archimedes, who was getting on in age at this point, would sit on the sidelines. And it was curious because everybody else was heaving these boulders, and they were very large men, young men. And Archimedes would sit on the sidelines and wait until the strongest man couldn't budge the boulder any longer. And then he would walk up and put a small stone right in front of the boulder and got a log, and then would use the power of leverage. He would use a lever to be able to move that boulder. And he always won the competitions. It was game over as soon as Archimedes showed up. And the reason was because he had the superhuman strength of leverage. So in my consulting career, I have always known that leverage was important. In fact, I commissioned an art piece that sits behind me in my office, a chalk drawing of Archimedes moving the world. And so I use this metaphor to say we can move our worlds in the arena of change by taking smart strategic actions. That leverage is about getting more done with less. And by that, I mean fewer hassles, headaches, and problems, which a lot of people associate with change, but also fewer resources, which gets a lot of people's attention because you spend less time spinning your wheels around change. You face less resistance when it comes to change. Change occurs faster when you use these 8 levers that I've identified, and each of them addresses a particular problem that I've heard clients, I've been doing this work 35 years, I've heard clients complain about these 8 particular problems for decades. And so I designed a lever to address each of those problems so that people who are trying to achieve results do so faster, easier, and better than they ever would have imagined possible otherwise.
It's a great way of putting it. I love the metaphor that you use. So let's jump right into it and look at some of these levers in more detail. And I'd like to start out with the first one, that in today's society, things are changing more than ever. And I'm sure that many of our listeners can relate to the following statement: there is too much change.
Right.
Extraordinary amounts of time and care go into crafting these very delicate messages, framing the change in the right ways. And they list all of those details, right? All of those impacts that are positive, yet they ignore, well, what if it doesn't work? What are some of the concerns that people have? One of my favorite quotes is, change is hard because people overestimate the value of what they have and underestimate the value of what they may gain by giving it up.
Yeah.
Can you speak more to this issue and then identify that lever that's going to help with the solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my world, clients talk about change fatigue, that they're inundated with the number of changes. And I love this because every year a new futurist comes out with a book and they say the next 10 years is going to have more change in it than the previous 100. And then you read the book and you think, wow, there's a lot of change coming. And then the next year rolls around and another futurist comes out with a book and says the next 10 years and so forth. So the amount of change isn't going away. And most organizations have two choices available to them. These are the organizations that haven't read the Leverage Change book yet. But the first one is you have a choice. If there's too much of something, then take something off your plate. Do less change. And this sounds like a really useful approach to the situation, except for one problem. And the one problem is people aren't just changing for change's sake. They're changing because they have to. They're changing because technology is changing, competition is changing, customer demands are changing. So doing less is really not a good idea. So then there's the second option, and this is by far the most popular in organizations today, which is push harder on the organization to accept the changes that you're trying to make. And so you try and force this on a system that's already at capacity. So what happens is that your change work suffers. It's not as effective, it's not as fast. People, in fact, put their heads down a lot of times and they wait, this too shall pass. And if I can hang on long enough, I won't have to bother with the latest changes that are coming. And current performance suffers as well, because while you're trying to fend off all these changes, then you find I had a client say to me the other day, it's like, I'm in so many meetings about new ways of doing things. And my boss says it's not that different. And this client of mine said, but it is that different. It's about whole new ways of doing business. And it may not be different for that person, but it's certainly different for me and it's different for my team. So when we deal with change, what people normally do is they focus on the change. They pay attention to the change and they try and do the change well. And they come back to cases for change and, like you said, strategies and framing it right. And all of these are different techniques that we use to pay attention to change. And what we find is that people get anxious. They get nervous, they get anxious, there's conflict around it. And so when you have too much change, the last thing in the world you want to do is be talking more and more about it.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So what we do is a paradoxical approach to change in the world of leverage change. And what we do is pay attention to continuity. Now, this sounds odd because we're trying to bring about change. Why are we paying attention to continuity? Continuity gives you clarity. It gives you confidence. It gives you conviction. All these things that give you firm ground to stand on as you take a leap into the unknown world of the future and of change, because we don't really know what's going to happen. Even our best laid plans, there are new realities that pop up and we've got to deal with those. So when you deal with continuity, it brings forward a different kind of energy. I've had a client that was sitting there overwhelmed by change. And I said, okay, let's make a list of all the changes in the organization. This was not a popular suggestion on my part because they were already overwhelmed. And they're like, why are we doing this? I said, trust the process, right? Favorite consultant lingo, trust the process. So we made a list of those changes. And as they made them, they slumped down in their chairs. Their voices got quieter. They literally were overwhelmed by what they were putting on the flip chart. I said, okay, now let's go to this other side of the room in this other flip chart. And let's write all the things that you're going to continue doing that you're already doing. But this time, make the list twice as long. And so as people started making this list, they sat up in their chairs. Their voices took on greater volume. They leaned forward. They started to feel like they were in charge of their own destiny again. So paying attention to continuity for me, Charles, is paying attention to the whole of reality. Change is one side of the coin, continuity is the other. And you can do this in really easy ways. So what are things that are about continuity in the organization? One of them is your vision and values. So when you talk about making changes, go back to those vision and values because those are something that people can count on. Go back and ask the question, what have we done well in the past that we need to continue doing in the future? Right? Because a lot of times when there's too much change, people drop the ball on what they've done well because they're trying to manage, right? They're juggling all these new things that are coming along. And so you miss some that you did well in the past and you end up not doing those as well. So by paying attention to continuity, there are a lot of benefits. And as I said, Paying attention to continuity is paradoxical. It's not what most people are going to do. They're going to pay more and more attention to change. And the more change you have, the more attention you think you need to pay to it. It's sort of a human reaction that I've got so much over here I've got to deal with. So put my attention there. What I'm saying is if you can take your attention and put it on continuity, change becomes much easier to deal with.
I love that paradoxical approach. Even in getting those previous resistors, right, or troublemakers and making them more celebrated as valuable contributors to.
Absolutely. They're some of your best friends. If you're a leader and you're bringing about change, those so-called curmudgeons or troublemakers that are always bringing up, you know, one more item on the agenda. They've got a different point of view on the issue that everybody's just agreed to. These are your best friends because they see things differently and they cover your backside. They look for things and see things naturally that the rest of the group is blind to. So if you start talking about continuity, and this is as simple as conversations, emails, town hall meetings, if you spend a little bit of time at the beginning on continuity, and what needs to stick over time, people are much more ready to listen to what you're going to say about change.
I love that. And I love the fact that this approach is being taken and it's just counterintuitive in some ways, but it makes a whole lot of sense. So we're
Absolutely.
living now in this change culture. Change is happening all the time. So the other big common issue I hear a lot is it's just taking too long.
Right.
So how do we get people to understand and to look maybe in the future more instead of just at the present to put it in the proper perspective?
Yeah. So I don't believe the change is really at fault here. We can look and blame the change and say, well, it's taking too long and it's too complicated and it's too difficult. And well, yeah, maybe, but that's not going to really help you because you have change that needs to be made. So, how do you accelerate the pace of change? This is where this second lever comes from. And when we normally think about the future, we think about it as occurring at a later point in time. It's something that's going to unfold before us and we'll wait for it. So, we're in 2022. I may have vision 2025, and success looks like actually achieving the vision in 2025. When I say to clients, well, what does 2023 sound like if we were to achieve the vision 2 years sooner? And they're like, well, how could that possibly happen? And I say, it's a paradigm issue. Like all of these levers, we can see the world differently. We can be in the world differently. So this lever is called think and act as if the future were now. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you get some picture of that future, rather than waiting for it to unfold before you, what I want you to do is reach out and grab some aspect of that future and start living it as if it were true here and now. And this comes from a guy who wrote a book way back in the 80s named Stan Davis. And he said, you need to manage in the future perfect tense of the verb. His book was called Future Perfect. And if you go to the dictionary, the future perfect tense of the verb is as if something had already happened. So once I start thinking and acting as if the future were now, then everything changes. Or am I acting in the present? And when that gets to be a difficult question, you're in good shape. And so when I say this, there was a client that I worked with, it was a senior executive team trying to build market share in a particular region. And they spent the morning working on coming up with a solution. And they had two different options that were available, and they couldn't agree on one or the other. And this happened to be an organization that was undergoing a culture change effort at the same time. They wanted to be more participative. So I said to them, I said, listen, if we were to be more participative now, not something that we're going to work to get to in, 2, 3 years. And a lot of people who talk about culture change taking a long period of time. I'm not one of them. I think you can start living that new culture instantaneously if you put it your mind to. So in this group, I said, well, who would be involved if you were a participative organization in this decision? And they started listing people. I was writing them, I couldn't keep up with them on the flip chart. They started listing salespeople from that region they thought would be a good group to include in trying to grow sales in that region. So all of these people started to get added to the list. And I said, all right, now let's tap into them as resources. And so they got their calendars out and they started marking for the next meeting and they would invite these people. And I said, no, think and act as if the future were now. I mean, today, right now, after lunch. And I said, how can we get these people into the meeting? And some of them were in the office and some of them weren't. And we got some on video, some on the phone. There were 25 more people in the meeting in the afternoon than had been in the morning. And they came up with a third answer that everybody agreed was better than the two that they were debating from the morning. So thinking and acting as if the future were now has a couple benefits to it. One of them is that change happens faster because I grab the future and bring it back. And when I say grab the future, you don't have to have the whole thing figured out. This is not painting the Mona Lisa. This is about getting a couple corners of that painting clear and grabbing hold and starting to live them today. The other benefit of it is that as people and organizations look to the left and right of themselves, they see people behaving in new and better ways of doing business. So if I look over at my colleague and I see that they're doing business in new ways, this whole thing about resisting change and is it going to happen and how hard and difficult is it and how long is it going to take? It's happening in the desk next to me. Right? I'm in a meeting and all of a sudden the leader of that meeting is behaving in ways that they said they wanted to in the future, but they're doing it in the present. So that makes it easier for a virtuous cycle. More and more people look around and they start seeing business done in better ways. More and more people see them, more and more people see them. So if you get an organization, and this can be a game that you can play in the organization, it's like, well, if we were serious about this change and we actually had it already implemented, how would that influence the decision that we're making right now? And the more and more people in your organization who ask that question, the faster and faster your change will take hold.
That's great information. Love it. Love how it's going to increase the believability index, right? As more people take a hold of it in the current.
This is exactly right.
So that virtuous cycle is excellent. Like,
And I
yeah,
used that term believability index myself, Charles. I don't know if that came from the book and you're reading it or we're just reading minds here, but believing that it's possible is one of the biggest challenges that people have in the world of change. And it's like, if I see you changed, that comes off the table. That argument disappears. And all of a sudden it's like, well, look, if Charles can do it, why can't I?
right. Absolutely. Another quote that I love regarding change. And I think this was an old quote, but if you don't change the direction, you may end up going where you're heading, right? So people really don't realize it could happen and you could be going down the wrong path much farther than what you think.
Yep.
Love to change management's been around forever. There's companies that have done it successfully. There's ones that have really messed up that process. Look at the early 80s, British Airways, when they came off of being state run and their new chairman at the time, John King, came in to turn it around in 1981. He had axed close to 20,000 jobs.
Yeah.
And trying to get everyone on the same page was a monumental undertaking. But he did it. He did it successfully. Netflix, 1997, when they saw the streaming market coming up,
Right.
it'd be in more demand, they had to transition off of.
Used to get those packages in the mail, right? Used to get your CD or your DVD in the mail, and that's what Netflix was. And now there are some people who wouldn't even remember that that was the business that they were in.
And at first, it was a tough change. They had to position it the right way. There's a number that I pulled that stated after surviving a drop in subscription numbers and stock figures, Netflix grew from 23 million subscribers in 2011 to over 137 million in
Wow.
2018. So they trusted their plan and it eventually worked, even though it required the company to shift gears pretty significantly. And then my favorite change management examples, because it seems that it's happening with this same company throughout time, is with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola throughout the years when in the 1980s, when Pepsi was starting to aggressively target Coke, Coke responded by making new Coke, making it sweeter to compete
Right,
better.
right,
Disaster, right?
right.
It's had the appeal to the public, and Coca-Cola very craftedly wasted no time in replacing it with the older formula.
Yeah,
The brand was able to respond quickly to consumer preferences, get that change initiated fast, and did a great job with it.
yep,
Also, by reacting quickly and proactively to the anticipation of trends throughout the last 20, 30 years, it's been around for so long. Change management is vital to this company and its overall strategic vision. Another one is when the health consciousness came out about a decade and a half ago with soft drinks that Coke then released Invega, Diet Coke, Coke Zero to appeal to that target market. And then during the Asian financial crisis, they pursued an acquisition strategy to better deal with customer preferences. So, great examples of organizations that have really done it the right way. Don't really want to go too far down the path of those that have done it the wrong way, but really wanted to highlight those and any insights or knowledge that you want to kind of bring to the table on any one of those or a company that you know of that you felt did it the right way from the start.
yeah. I think, Charles, that the thing that highlights for me in what you're describing of these successes is they were really clear about the results they were trying to achieve, and they were the right results strategically. So I took a whole chapter in the book and I said, look, if you follow these levers, you will get faster, easier, better results. That's going to be a given. And if you're focused on the wrong results, if you're headed in the wrong direction, you can sink your ship faster, easier, and better than you'd ever imagine possible. So paying attention to results and getting those right and doing your homework is really critical. And I've got a safety valve for people in terms of using this leverage change approach. And that is something that I learned in the manufacturing world called rapid prototyping. And rapid prototyping is about short learning loops. It's about testing, working on many fronts at once and checking out and seeing, is this going to be useful and what part of it? So if you think of the sailboat going down towards A to B, then yeah, a motorboat may have a straight line, but sailing, if you take something too far before you check in on it, you could be way off course and never realize it until the race is over. So I'm a big proponent of tacking rapidly so that you stay as close to that straight line as possible and you never get too far off your desired results. And so what you're describing that Coke has done and British Air has done is they also not only were good at making changes happen, but they were smart about the changes they were doing. And like you said, they came out with a couple of different options with Coke so that they could test in the marketplace and see what was going to work. I mean, they did have a test, new Coke, and they rapidly found out that was not a good idea. And rather than trying to push it harder or come up with new marketing or somehow get the public to get it right, right? It's like they knew and the public didn't know. They very quickly pulled back from that strategy and found ones that worked for them, but only through trial and error. I believe that in fact some of the most successful companies are the ones that make the most mistakes the fastest, learn from them, and then adapt going forward.
I couldn't agree with you more. Fail fast, fail forward. That experiment, repeat, rinse and repeat cycle is so critical. That's what we've done with our company in this very challenging time is to have these small experiments, learn from them, iterate, scale up when they work, tweak it when it may not work great, or scrap it if it's not something that
Exactly. Be willing to let go of something that's not working, even if it's your baby. And I would say, especially if it's your baby, because people don't want to let go of something that they have ownership of. And we own what we help create. And so ownership is a really powerful and can often be a very positive thing in organizations. When we talk about change, all people are talking about how do you develop ownership in people for that change, but ownership can be a double-edged sword. And like you're saying, it's like, well, if I have ownership over something and it's not working, then I got to learn how to let go and move on. And my baby may be the ugly baby. And if it is, that's okay. I'm not arguing that we should abandon our children. But what I am arguing for is that when things aren't working, realize it, celebrate that you found it out early, and then act on it, but act on it immediately.
And that is critical, right? It's you want them to have a vested interest, but you also need for them to be aware of the sunk trap cost, right? So before we end this episode, wanted to discuss some of those change management principles that I've seen firsthand work and have heard a lot in the media and literature with other practitioners. Get your insight and input on those to see if they do have that impact, or if you might want to tweak those a little bit to say it would work, but I would prefer this change in the strategy
Sure.
as a result. So the first one is making sure that we get help from change champions within the organization. My question would be, how many do we need and what roles do they have to occupy?
Right. So I'm going to take an unpopular view here and say, Charles, everybody in the organization can become a change champion if you approach it the right way. So if you take these levers, one of the levers deals with this not invented here syndrome and people rejecting that. And so I've got a lever that's called design it yourself. And what that means is that the people in the organization design their own change effort. Rather than coming in and saying, here are the 8 steps, I know the way, the truth, and the light, and you should follow me. I've written books on this. This book is about supplementing the work you're already doing. It's about turbocharging the approach that you're already using. So I'm not coming in saying you've got to change and what you're doing is wrong. What I look for is what's right about the work you're already doing and how do we make a good thing even better. So this whole notion of people looking and saying, hey, is this the right path or not? Can I believe in this? You got to develop a future that people want to call their own. And in doing so, I can see myself in that future and I want to be part of it. So there's a whole pull strategy that comes into play instead of pushing people and trying to force them into the future. What I believe is that we've got to find ways to engage them in creating that future. And if I'm creating that future, I'm going to create a space for myself in that future and one that I'm going to want to play in a role that makes sense for the whole organization.
Love that approach and think that's definitely the preferred approach instead of identifying those champions. Make it a future that everyone has a vested interest in and get them to have ownership right from the start. So the final one is testing out the change on smaller groups before rolling it out to an organizational wide initiative. Hopefully,
Right.
then identifying those roadblocks or pain points that you can address before you build it out. Good strategy, or is there a more preferred or better approach?
I'm going to say yes and. All right. So this rapid prototyping can be seen as piloting. Right. So it's like you can go out there and test several things at the same time. And in some people's minds, those are pilots. Now, personally, I have one issue with pilots, which is that when they're often done, they get a lot of attention, they get a lot of resources. Senior executives are paying attention to what's being done, how it's being done. You're under a microscope, and it's also has an unreality to it. It's like, that's not how business gets done every day in organizations, that they have extra resources and extra attention and they get on the senior executive agenda. So when I talk about this, I don't believe that getting a specific pilot set up in one part of the organization and feeding it all of the resources that the rest of the organization's not going to have available, I don't find that helpful. I find that that creates more mischief than good, right? Because the next group that goes after it isn't going to have that special attention and they're going to look for it and they're going to find out that they fall short. And then it gets blamed on those people for somehow dropping the ball. But if you do the rapid prototyping, you can move on many fronts at once, but those many fronts at once are across the whole system. And I believe that if you change well, if you follow these levers and you pay attention to making sure that people have an opportunity to make a meaningful difference is another one of the levers. And when you have too much on your plate, then being able to make change work part of daily work can be really helpful. If you follow these levers, you don't have to worry about sectioning off some part of the organization and trying it and keeping a bubble around that part of the organization. You really can move across the whole system at the same time. And you can be trying different things, even in different parts of the organization, as long as we're headed to the same end result, as long as we're headed to the same preferred future. There's no problem with creativity and experimentation. Those are all about then looking and saying, well, what worked well about each of these approaches that we took? And how can we get the best of the best in moving forward? And I think that that is why I say yes. And I think that the pilot strictly seeing things as pilots can be problematic, but moving on many fronts at once, having more than one thing that you're undertaking in an organization, I think that's healthy. And I think that that's the way organisms have evolved. Living systems theory is one way of looking at organizations. And I think that that's what steps up for evolution in organizations to be able to move into the future is to learn. And the best way to learn is to try, but try more than one thing at a time to be able to learn from those rather than setting something up as an unreal expectation for resources, attention, and all those things I've been talking about.
Love that prototyping approach to build a more inclusive change initiative for the entire organization. Great information. As we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end it with a call to action. If there's one thing, or what's the first thing that our listeners should start if they want to strengthen their change management muscles, or what lever would you recommend them looking into first?
I believe that this second lever that we talked about, think and act as if the future were now, is the most unique of the levers and possibly the most powerful because speed is something that people care about and they have to care about in organizations today. So the problem is clear. The solution about changing your paradigm, changing the way that you see the world and saying, you know what? If that's the way I want it to be, then claim it, be that way now and make the difference for yourself and your team and your organization by not waiting for the future to unfold before you, but really grabbing hold and making it part of your present. And I have worked in, like you said, dozens of organizations, Charles. And once this starts to take hold as a cultural piece of the organization, when they start saying, well, wait a second, if we were serious about this and we were being in our future now, what criteria would we use for this decision? What people would be in the room for this conversation? How would I, as a leader, behave if I have this vision of myself in the future behaving in particular ways? Well, what does that look like if I bring it into the here and now? And that is a very powerful question. It's an easy question, it's a powerful question, and it's one that I've seen make a difference in organizations of all types for the last 3+ decades.
I would agree, and I love that advice. So right now, let us know how they can get a hold of you, our listeners. And then if there's any books or resources, I want you to talk about your book as well, that you would recommend them to read or to reference in regards to change management.
Sure. So you can find me at jakejacobsconsulting.com. That's my website. And if you go there, there's a free ebook download. And I would recommend that you start with this. What it's called is 27 ways to achieve faster, easier, better results immediately. And what it has is for each of these 8 levers, we've covered a couple of them, but there's 8 in total. So even the ones that we didn't cover, you can look in this ebook and there are 3 or 4 ideas, very practical, roll up your sleeves, go do now ideas for you to take action in line with that lever. So just to give your listeners a quick example of this, if you look and you've got somebody resisting change and the change that you're trying to make in the organization, typically what we do is we call them troublemakers. I even had one client, Charles, that stopped inviting this guy to meetings because he caused so much trouble in the meeting. And they said, hey, we've solved the problem. We just don't have this guy show up to meetings anymore. And I'm like, No, this is not a good answer. You can't exclude the person who sees things differently. You got to make friends with these people. But if you look and you say, hey, we've got to do some things differently in this organization, then I think the best way to do it is to engage people in crafting what that future looks like and invite them into the change process. So in this book, I say, look, if you've got somebody resisting your change effort, go have the conversation with them, but not from a place of conflict. Assume they're wise. Assume they see something you don't, and then ask them to tell you more. I say there's 4 magic words in the book. Could you say more? It's the best way to learn. So if we go to these people and we say, could you tell me a little bit more about why you're resisting this? Like, what is the issue? And then together figure out how to address it. Trust these people that they're not actually sandbagging. They're not trying to create trouble. They don't wake up in the morning and say, how can I make this person's day miserable? It's not what gets them out of bed in the morning. So they care often as much as you do about the organization. They're just paying attention to different things. So these 27 ways are very concrete ways of going out and saying, you could take action on this, work in line with this lever, and get faster, easier, better results. And as the title of the book says, immediately.
Sounds great and some great advice. And just for wanted to give another plug to your book because a lot of books in this space are theoretical, don't provide actual advice, but your book has compelling stories and the examples bring these levers to life. And that's what's most refreshing about the book is having that actionable advice outlined in leverage change that supports everything from high profile industry wide change initiatives to small personal changes that
Yeah.
anyone might want to take. So I really enjoyed that about the book and about your approach. Thank you so much, Jake, for being a part of this episode of the IMS podcast.
Thank you for having me, Charles. I really do appreciate the opportunity. And I love the questions and I love the IMS and the work that you're doing in the world. I think it's terrific.
Thank you, Jake. And this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, it can be found on both Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And remember, until next time, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes the difference.